Hi, everybody. This is Saad. Today I have a new series of evolutionary-minded folks that are coming on my show. Although I've had many evolutionary-minded people in the past, today I've got Colin Wright with me, an evolutionary biologist. How you doing, Colin?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. So I want to get your brief bio, so please forgive me as I put my elderly reading glasses on. Uh, PhD in 2018 in evolutionary biology from UCSB. I'll have some stuff to talk about UCSB because I have a connection there to them. Then from 2018 to 2020, an Eberly Research Fellow at Penn State. I guess that's some kind of post PhD position. You have a Substack titled Reality's Last Stand. I like that title. And then you're also a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Anything that you'd like to add before we proceed?
That's about it. That's covers everything.
Okay, well, I guess the first thing I wanted to say is that I mean, you were in evolutionary biology, but are you aware that two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology were housed at, well, one of them is still housed, but one of them recently passed away. Lida Cosmides and John Tooby, were you aware, or do you know those guys?
Yeah, I'm aware of them, and for some reason, when I was in Santa Barbara, they just weren't on my radar for whatever reason. So I started grad school at the University of Pittsburgh, and then our lab transferred over to Santa Barbara. So I was at Santa Barbara for the last 2 years of my PhD. And it was just me basically frantically writing my all my studies up for my dissertation. So I really should have looked into who else was there. They weren't in my department. I was in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Marine Biology. And where were they? I'm not exactly sure what their department was,
So
but it wasn't
they're,
my department. Otherwise, I would have known.
yeah, so but just for our viewers and listeners who may not know of them, let me mention them, and then in doing so, it'll answer your query. So John Tooby and Lida Cosmides are two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, which is the application of evolutionary biological principles to the study of the human mind. And so, in the exact same way that you would apply evolutionary thinking to study the mating behavior of the salamander or every other species known to mankind, we'd apply those principles to study human behavior, which of course causes all kinds of consternation in social scientists because human beings are the only ones that are not within the purview of biology somehow. Now, they are part of what's called the Santa Barbara Church. It's kind of facetiously because they have a particular strain of thinking when it comes to evolutionary psychology. Specifically, they promulgated the idea, I mean, they weren't the only ones, but of the domain specificity of the human mind, meaning that
Hmm.
the human mind is not simply an amalgamation of domain general mechanisms, like, say, IQ, but the human mind also has evolved specific computational system for specific evolutionarily relevant ancestral problems: find mate, retain mate, avoid predators, seek nutritious food, avoid poisonous foods, and so on, right? And so they were housed in the psychology department. They were both trained in one in biological anthropology, one in cognitive psychology at Harvard, but they really are two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, which in a sense, it's a shame that you never got to meet them, but it demonstrates how academia works in these completely isolated
Yeah.
silos, such that someone like you studying evolutionary biology would never meet two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology.
Yeah. Yeah, and my work, I didn't study humans, but I studied animal personalities at both the individual and group level, so collective personalities of social insects and arachnids. And so I mean, it's basically like an evolutionary psychology, but applied to animals rather than humans. And strangely enough, they use pretty widely different methods when they go about studying animals versus studying humans, mainly because you can't, give animals a survey to fill out or anything like that. But yeah, it would have been fascinating to talk to them. And I wonder how they're doing now because I know that in the sort of the spring of 2020, I got the emails circling around. I was at Penn State at the time, but I got the emails from them. I still receive a lot of them about all the the BLM chapters on campus, sort of trying to take over the evolution, ecology, marine biology program, making them try to reflect Berkeley's hiring program, where they needed to make DEI part of not even just, people coming into grad school, but professors trying to get raises, to get tenure, all these things. And I talked to some professors who were there, and they said the department has not even returned back to normal since then. It was sort of this mad takeover since I left. So I wonder how some of them are doing over there. Because if you're studying Evo Psych, that's considered pretty taboo. And Santa Barbara was pretty on the precipice of being woke when I left, and was taken over shortly thereafter.
Right. No, well, look, so I don't know specifically how they're faring, but as you probably know, as you just said, evolutionary psychology remains something that's very contentious in the human context. And by the way, that was my original, if you like, foray into understanding parasitized minds, which then led me to, many years later, write The Parasitic Mind. Because originally in my academic work, my goal has always been to introduce evolutionary thinking into human behavior in general, consumer and economic behavior in particular. Hence, I'm housed in a business school. Actually, I remember I had been invited. I was a visiting professor at UC Irvine. I had been invited to UCSB to speak to their group, meaning John Tooby and Lita Cosmides. And as we were walking around, the beach area, so I turned to John and I say, who recently passed away, may he rest in peace. I said to him, John, can you hook me up with a professorship here? I mean, I can get used to living here and hanging around with you guys and doing work. And then his answer was, what would a glitzy business school professor that probably makes a lot more money in the business school want to do with us? And then he had told me that the teaching loads weren't good and the salary certainly from a business school professor were not very impressive. But that, just to finish my point, I had always thought it was insane, which of course now you write a lot about the gender ideology stuff, that it was insane that I would get such blowback from my business school colleagues and more generally the social scientists, that how dare you apply biology to study, consumer behavior. Surely you don't think that consumers are driven by evolutionary forces, physiology, hormones, and so on. And that's when I sort of had the little eureka, boy, supposedly smart people can be real imbeciles. And then, of course, eventually, that parasitic framework applied to so many other things. What was now you came from the world of studying, you said insects, was it?
Yeah, social insects and arachnids.
Exactly. And so maybe there wasn't as much of an obstacle of applying evolutionary theory there, but what was your eureka moment or epiphany? Oh boy, we've got a problem here with applying biology to humans.
I have to say that since my work wasn't dealing with humans, my experience with sort of this backlash against people studying humans was more just theoretical, seeing what was going on, studying what happened to E.O. Wilson back in the day, and sort of seeing people that I knew who were in evolutionary psychology make basic statements about evolutionary psychology. Just, the most basic things that our brains have evolved to do these things. Males and females have evolved to do slightly different things, and so we might expect differences in behavior. Just sort of basic
Yes.
sociobiology like that. And they were just hit over the head for saying this stuff. My when it got personal for me was not so much about the Evo Psych stuff, but it was when my colleagues started posting things about there being like 5 sexes or sexes of spectrum, all that stuff. And then as someone who learned a lot about what biological sex was, because if you're studying animal behavior or the behavior of any even humans, one of the first things you learn about in your animal behavior class is anisogamy, the differences between individuals who are producing egg and sperm because of the different parental investments that go in there that create different entirely reproductive strategies. There's so many like downstream consequences for bodies that house these two reproductive strategies that if you don't take that into account when you're studying the behavior of organisms, your data set's gonna be a complete mess. You need to understand these things. And so when people were talking about maybe there's 5 sexes in humans, like Anne Fausto Sterling, or maybe sex was just a social construct and it's arbitrary, and there's an infinite number of sexes based on genital morphology or whatever. That's when I started being like, what the hell is going on? And if you'll remember the Nature article called Sex Redefined that came out in, I think, 2015 by Claire Ainsworth, that was, to me, just a major moment of seeing this stuff in magazines like Scientific American, before on blogs like Tumblr and among activists. And all of a sudden, here it was in Nature, where they're saying that sex has been redefined. And now there was apparently some consensus among biologists that I wasn't aware of, that sex is much more complicated than just males and females for humans. So that was my oh crap moment. We're in a lot of trouble. Not so much the Evo Psych stuff, because I didn't touch that in graduate school. I was comfortably studying my spiders and wasps and reading my books from E.O. Wilson and that type of stuff.
I just finished reading his autobiography, Naturalist, and I highly recommend. Have you read it, Colin?
I have back in the day when I was first getting into sort of these topics and becoming fascinated with social behavior and social insects. Naturalist, I think, was one of the first ones from him that I read. And I think I read Consilience afterwards, which was just, a book that everyone has to read if they want to be
Oh, thank
a
you. I
scientist in my
basically
mind.
say
Yeah.
this every week. I'll at least say it
Yeah,
twice.
yeah. Yeah, it's mind-blowing. It's like a must read. You have to read Consilience
Oh,
for
I'm
sure.
getting goosebumps you saying it. For those of you who don't know, consilience is actually something that's been incredibly important in my own writing. It refers to, I mean, literally, that's, I think, the subtitle of his book, Consilience, Unity of Knowledge. The idea that you can unify what appear to be disparate areas of, human input. So you could take the social sciences, the natural sciences, the humanities, and while these seem to be very, very different, they actually can be unified. And in his case, and of course I agree, and I do the same thing in my work, he argues that you can unify through the consilient lens of evolutionary theory, right? And so in a lot of my writings in this book right here, in Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, the last chapter is all about how incorporating evolutionary thinking into the study of consumer behavior would allow the field to be consilient. It would have actually a unified tree of knowledge rather than having completely disparate, disorganized studies that are otherwise completely unrelated to one another. And so I highly recommend, I second what Colin said, Consilience should be read by everybody. But so going now, of course, E.O. Wilson was himself an entomologist, so he studied social insects and so on. Can you tell us about some of the, I'm sure, mind-blowing stuff that you studied in your short career as someone who studied insects and acrid? And
Yeah.
go ahead.
So I studied two different systems. So my advisor, he had a sort of this torturous way about him where he wanted us to pursue two PhDs side by side in two completely different systems. And then whatever research program bared more fruit, that's the one that we would publish as our actual dissertation. So it resulted in a lot of papers, but it was just frantic. So I studied, my dissertation ended up being on the social spider, Stegodipus demicola. It's one of about 35 spiders that actually exist in a social group. So they're highly inbred. These are in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana area. And so when it was winter in the US, I'd go down to South Africa and I would study these colonies. I would basically go around to these areas. We would drive along the highways. A lot of the spiders, their webs were located on fences. So we'd go to these colonies. We'd on the fences. We'd take them, bring them into the lab. So we'd maybe collect, say, like 30 colonies out in nature. We'd break them apart. We would isolate every single spider. There's anywhere between 20 and 400 spiders in any one colony. We would do behavioral assays on every single individual in these colonies, testing them for whether their score for boldness. So if there's a bold and shy sort of axis in animal behavior, it's basically your propensity to engage in a type of risky behavior. And some
Right.
spiders take more risks, some take less risks. We call it boldness and shyness. And then what we would do is we would sort of play God, and would create artificial colonies of known composition from these bigger colonies. We'd create colonies of 20 spiders that are all really bold or all really shy or any sort of complex mixture of bold and shy. And then we would have them do sort of different tasks, like how well do they hunt for prey? How well do they repair their webs? Just sort of how much their survival. We'd even put the colonies back in the field over a couple of generations and see how they're doing based on their colony compositions. So that's what I did for a lot of my spider work. I specifically looked at their ability to combat invasive, not invasive, sorry, but these predatory ants. There are these called pugnacious ants. They were all over South Africa. And the spiders sort of have this adaptation in areas where the spiders were really prevalent. They would sort of build more and more webs around their colony. So I basically looked if there was an interaction between the colony composition and their propensity to withstand these raids by these ants. And it turned out to be no, because the ants were really super aggressive. But there was a difference between the spider colonies in their if they were exposed in advance to the sort of the sense of these ants, they would all modify their entire colony level behavior just with these indirect cues. So I was more looking at sort of whether if you can warn colonies or not, and if their colony composition matters for that. Then I studied social paper wasps, and I was interested in looking at, can I predict the collective behavior of the entire colonies based on knowing just the singular behavior of the queen who founds the colony in the beginning of the season. And so the queens basically had a similar sort of bold, shy personality type to them. So it's an experiment I devised where you'd basically antagonize them on the nest. Some of the queens would hold their ground and sort of never leave the nest if you're antagonizing them. And then some queens would fly away immediately if you just give them a prod with a brush or a stick of some sort. And what I was able to find is the queens that were quickly to fly away from their colonies, abandon their nests when you're antagonizing them, gave rise to colonies that were also very quick to leave their nests. But instead of flying away, they would attack you. They would attack the intruder. Whereas the colonies that had queens that stood their ground and fought with you on their nests actually gave rise to colonies that were less aggressive. The workers were less likely to leave their nests in attack. So you could vibrate these entire colonies and they wouldn't swarm. So that was an interesting thing. They also linked sort of queen behavior and size to in the field to their survival and reproduction. So
Oh my
those were the
God.
things I did in grad
So
school.
many places I can go with this. Let me try to go to a few places. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I've talked about, I actually published a short paper. It was in the European Journal of Social Psychology, I think, or maybe I can't remember the exact title of the journal. I think European Journal of Social Psychology. It was a special issue on the evolutionary roots and the evolutionary genetics of personality, and that's a really interesting concept, because one of the and I lecture about this often in my course and so on. Why is it that some traits become fixed, such that we have two eyes, I mean, unless you have a congenital problem, you have one heart, right? Those are fixed. They don't follow normal distribution, whereas personality types are not fixed. And so one of the arguments for why evolution has not fixed an optimal personality type. So one argument is that there are, and I think it fits nicely with some of the stuff that you were talking about there, is that there isn't a singular social ecosystem where a singular personality type is optimal across all ecosystems. And so the analogy that I give is, when, let's say, a company, so in the context of, say, I'm lecturing this in the business school, I want the students to kind of link it to something in their business world. Well, when an organization gives you a personality test as part of hiring you, they're actually not, they're testing whether your personality matches optimally with their organizational culture. And so the same person, Colin, has this whatever personality type that he has, it is optimal for JP Morgan, but it is suboptimal for Google. And so it's not that there is a singular optimal, Colin personality. He's great here, he's bad there. And therefore, there are no selection pressures for a singular personality profile to dominate across all contexts. Is this something that you've kind of covered in your own thinking?
Yeah, big time. I think we would call this sort of a niche partitioning
Exactly.
in your environment, because if all organisms are the same and they're, within a species and they're trying to go after the exact same resource in the exact same way, then, there's going to be others that can outcompete them, and then they're screwed. But if they're able to sort of partition their niches and say, okay, well, they're really better at that, but I can also maybe get 20% of that, but I can divert more of my attention into the secondary food source, and I can sort of, take some of those things. I can get really good at doing those. So it's just a way that individuals can still have, adapt to their environment and sort of partition their niche out more and more finely. when you come to things like social organisms, this idea was that there was maybe an optimal way to behave within a colony. Like if you're a wasp, you need to be really aggressive or something. And the differences in behavior, this had long been viewed as just sort of this developmental noise. This was just random variation. It wasn't really adaptive. And then it came to discover like, well, I mean, we see these behavioral variations like a lot. We see inter-individual differences in behavior across time and context. That's what personality is. Wouldn't our default assumption be that maybe this is adaptive? We see it everywhere in systems where we wouldn't even expect it, maybe. And so you can actually test these in many systems, in mice, spiders, and bees, and pretty much any social system that has ever been looked at. You find not only that personality variation exists, but you also find that often these personality variations are linked to their proficiency at certain tasks within the colony. There's sort of a division of labor that is happening. And we see this in the spiders that I looked at too, where you have aggressive spiders. You ever heard of the aggression spillover hypothesis?
I don't think so.
So it's when you have an individual that is like so aggressive, like maybe they went through this selective environment where it's selected for really, really aggressive individuals. This happens to a lot of spiders. And sometimes females will get so aggressive that they'll actually sterilize themselves effectively, behaviorally, because they'll kill any male that tries to mate with them because they're so aggressive. And so you see like this selection sort of against aggression, but then they still have to be going through the environment of being aggressive. So it's almost like a maladaptive, adaptive sort of situation they're in. We see the same thing in a lot of the spiders that are in our colonies, where we have really aggressive spiders and really docile spiders. The aggressive spiders, they have like no chill. They cannot, if you take shy spiders, docile spiders out of the colony, they can't become less aggressive to fulfill their niche. They're just always really aggressive. And so when you have a colony that's composed of nothing but really aggressive spiders, well, they're really good at combating enemies and making sure their colonies are free of parasites and things like that, because they attack anything in sight. But they end up attacking their young as well, so they have much fewer offspring output than colonies that have, say, a bunch of really docile individuals who are better at caretaking. But if you have nothing but really docile individuals, well, then you're going to get destroyed by any sort of intruder or parasites that take over your colony. So there is this optimal mixture, usually, of the aggressive and docile spiders, so they can partition their behavior and division of labor based on colony need. And the shy ones are usually able to upregulate their aggression and become more aggression if you take aggressive ones out. Not really great, but more so than the aggressive ones. So yeah, there's the aggression spillover of the aggressive spiders that can become maladaptive. But if you have a colony, if you have a group, you can be multiple types of behaviors at once. There is no single behavior because the entire colony can be finely tuned as it will.
A couple of more geeky, nerdy, evolutionary biology.
I love it. I never get to talk about this stuff. I love it.
I know. Me too. I mean, I could sit and just geek out on all that stuff. So number one, are you familiar with Sam Gosling? Does that ring a bell?
It rings a major bell.
It rings a bell. So Sam Gosling is a psychologist at University of Texas, Austin, who has studied personality differences. I don't know if it was strictly with dogs but I mean, I know for sure he did it with dogs, but I think maybe with others as well. So I know that you're no longer in academia, but I think it might be someone that you might be interested. I mean, it's in a completely different, animal taxa. It's not insects, it's not spiders. It's mammals. It's our closest, buddies, dogs. But that actually speaks to another point, because you were talking about social species. In the paper that I mentioned earlier that I had written in whatever European Journal of Social Psychology, it was a response article to a target article. And I think it was in that target article where I had read a finding, which maybe you might remember the reference, because I think it's a mind-blowing finding. If you look across species within a particular, say felines, right? So if you are a social species within felines, which lions would be an example of, many of the other felines are solitary other than for mating purposes, then what you find is that the more social the species is, the greater the personality heterogeneity within that species. So lions will have greater personality variance in, inter-individuals than would cheetahs, which again speaks to our earlier point that personality heterogeneity is a means by which you might be optimal in one social ecosystem but not another. Are you familiar with that general finding?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, and that's basically what a lot of our research is I guess based on because
Yeah.
when you look at social species, you do see this division of labor, and because social species are the only types of species that can divide labor, and so there is good selection pressures to have these two different maxima, I guess, of selection within a colony that you don't get in solitary species, quite so well defined.
Very cool. Last question, because you mentioned earlier parental investment, which to us, because we're in the evolutionary, ecosystem, okay, we get what that is. But I actually think that that's one of the most unbelievable insights within evolutionary thinking, and it demonstrates the consilience, the explanatory power, the parsimony of an insight that could then be applied across all sexually reproducing species. It's Robert Trivers who proposed parental investment theory, and he said, look, if you want to understand the pattern of sex differences in any species, simply look at the minimal obligatory parental investment of the two sexes within that species. For
Mhm.
most species, it ends up being that females provide the greater minimal obligatory parental investment. So that has downstream effect on their morphology, on their sexual behaviors, on all sorts of things. But in many fewer species, you have what's called sex role reversal species, where it is the males who provide the greater minimal obligatory parental investment. So what do you think happens to all the sex differences? They're perfectly reversed. It's the males
Yeah.
that are smaller. It's the males that have less testosterone. It's the males that are less aggressive. It's the males that are more sexually choosy. I mean, you couldn't make up the data if you
Yeah.
wanted to be so accurate. So one of the things that pisses me off so much about all the idiots on social media and so on is when they say, oh, but come on, you're an evolutionary psychologist. It's just so theorizing. You sit with a cognac, you smoke a cigar, and you just pontificate post hoc bullshit. Whereas in reality, it's the exact opposite. For
Yeah. Yeah.
you to be able to establish that a phenomenon is truly veridical, the evidentiary threshold that you go through before you tick it off, as I think we've got convincing data, is astoundingly higher than the rest of the sciences. What are your thoughts on
Yeah.
that, Colin?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. This is the whole consilient aspect of biological sex of male and female, is what I try to drive home in all my talks that I give on this topic. Because what you see is a lot of activists who are basically trying to move away from a consilient aspect of view of sex and just sort of reduce it to these individualized to the level of the individual without any links to across species, across time, or anything. So I use the analogy of, back before we knew the sun was the center of our solar system, you had these models and they had what are called, I think they're called epicycles that they needed to introduce into
Yeah.
the models because the planets were moving in weird ways. And so like, oh, we can add these little loop-de-loops in our model of the solar system, and then you add a loop-de-loop, and oh, it actually kind of explains, it fixes this error, but two other small errors pop up over here, and don't worry, we'll just keep adding epicycles, and they just keep adding those, and then you see these models, after many years of this process of just adding epicycles and patching it up with more and more, that there's these cumbersome like Rube Goldberg like models of the solar system they had. And then you just get the bright idea. It's like, well, what if we, instead of just adding infinite numbers of these epicycles, what if we just like move the sun from here to there? And then you see all the orbits there, they're just form these perfect ellipses, and it's just everything makes sense all of a sudden. So what we're seeing, and I've shown papers on this of what the activists are trying to do to the biology of sex, is they're trying to like look at sex in these different levels of, look, you have your chromosomal sex, your gametic sex, your hormonal sex, your morphological sex, and they think none of these takes precedence over any other. Even though we would say that your gametic sex is your sex, and all these other things are just either upstream causes of your sex or downstream consequences. but they try to break it down into these graphs that are just all over the place. And I look at this and it's just like they're adding epicycles. They're moving away from the perfect ellipses of a solar system, what we have of males and females. And the reason that we know that, a male seahorse is the one that gives birth is because of they're the ones that are producing gametes. The reason we can identify sex reversal in birds or any other species is because their gametes don't match the behavior we would typically expect of their sex. And the activists are just trying to just get rid of all of that completely in favor of this system that is just completely, it looks sciencey. They make sciencey looking graphs, but it's just it's sophistry. It makes absolutely no sense. And then it has another layer of being incredibly socially harmful in many different contexts.
Well, I love your analogy, and you may or may not know this, but Kepler himself was famous for using analogical reasoning in arriving. So it's interesting that you're using a cosmological analogy to talk about sex when Kepler himself. I talk about this in this book, in the happiness book, when I'm discussing the importance of analogical reasoning in science, that it's such an important tool, which actually allows for greater interdisciplinarity and consilience. Because
Yeah.
once you're generating analogies, you're saying this is linked to that in a meaningful way, in the exactly that you just said. One last point about parental investment, then I want to get into how you decided, I think, to the regret of your field, to leave academia and so on. But
Yeah.
parental investment theory actually applies to spiders in the following sense. I mean, I know you know this, but I want to say it for. So spiders, or some spiders, engage in what's called sexual cannibalism, where, to your earlier point about the females being super aggressive, in this case, what happens is, in order for the male to mate with the female, he has to give himself up as a packet of calories so that she eats him while he's mating with her. Now, what would parental investment theory exactly predict? Well, what is a greater minimal parental obligatory investment than to kill yourself in the service of mating? So what do you end up getting in those species? Gigantic females and as
Yep.
minuscule males. I mean, we're not talking about a sexual dimorphism of, in the human context, it's, I think, about 15%. Although I've always thought that seems to underestimate how much males are bigger than females in the
Yeah.
human context. But I think it's 15% is the official number, or something around that, right?
Yeah. It fails to account for the multivariate sort of combinatory effect of the differences. Any one metric is like no greater than 15%, but if you were to combine them all and multiply them, it's vastly higher.
It's exactly. Well, in the context of spiders who engage in sexual cannibalism, yeah, I mean, you tell me what the number is, but it's in the order of their 100-fold bigger, right? Or
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
right?
Or more. Yeah.
Or
Sometimes
more,
it's
exactly.
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I remember at one point I was giving a talk at USC where some smarmy, marketing professor was like, "What is this bullshit biology stuff you talk about?" And then he gave as an example, "Then how do you explain spider behavior?" And I literally hit him with the sexual cannibalism example as a demonstration of parental investment theory in a sexual reversal species, and he just shut his mouth like the idiot that he was. All right, we're done with geeking out on insects, and although we could spend another 5 hours talking about it. Why did you leave academia? What happened?
That's a big question, I suppose. I'll be as succinct as possible. So I got into academia to be a scientist because I was involved in sort of the new atheist community back in the day, and I really got into evolution when I was arguing with a lot of creationists and intelligent design people. And I used to run a blog where I sort of was debunking a lot of pseudoscience, whether it was like qigong type artificial folk medicine type stuff, or it was mainly debunking creationism and intelligent design claims. Um, I stopped doing a lot of that when I was in grad school because I just didn't have time. I was focused on doing my work, but I idolized people like Richard Dawkins and a lot of the other four horsemen, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, rest
Are
in
you still
peace.
idolizing Sam Harris?
I'm a fan, but I would definitely disagree with him on some of his tech censorship views. But
Right.
I think he's got such a large backlog of work that's great. I can't abandon all of that. But yeah, I would love to have a chat with him about sort of where we disagree on some big issues now. So I was doing a lot of this uh, work as sort of in the new atheism space. Really cared about what's true. That's something that Dawkins always instilled in me is that, we are scientists, you care about what's true. And then people like Hitchens, they were just these bulldogs who just they don't care what you think. They're gonna say what's on their mind and they're gonna deal with the consequences. So as I was going through graduate school, I just sort of noticed this percolating ideas of five sexes, sex is a spectrum, whatever. And when I started pushing back, just as a scientist, making a very scientific, oh, I think people are just wrong about biology. Here's why I think you're being misunderstanding of what it means to be male or female. I was expecting this scientific arguments back. I would giving them reasons and
Oh, you
scientific
young
arguments.
child.
My sweet summer child. Yeah, and I realized, they just immediately went full, all the way to 11, you're a bigot, racist, sexist, homophobe, bigot. And this was it was shocking. And my initial response was to completely pull back and expunge my social media and things like that because I was applying for professor jobs. I was writing DEI statements at the time and trying to make it so I wasn't saying stuff I disagreed with, and it was this nightmare. Um, and then I couldn't look away from what was happening because I realized that there was something there and it was really important. Not only was they weren't just wrong about biology, but there were many ways in which it was harming society in a big way. You could talk about males and female sports, what people are doing to the whole gender affirming care thing, trying to say that sex is a mutable property and we can align kids' physical sex with their brain sex. There's a million problems with that whole thing. But this was having just tremendous real world effects. And so I ended up writing an article that got published in the Wall Street Journal in 2020. It was called The Dangerous Denial of Sex, and that went like incredibly viral. And I had a lot of my colleagues just denounce me. People started posting on on job boards. There's one called Evo Job. That's probably the biggest one for ecologists and evolutionary biologists. People posting job listings that Colin Wright is a transphobe, racist, white supremacist, don't hire him. And so it was just this full court press to try to destroy my reputation in academia. And I decided I wasn't going to back down. I was still going to be talking about this in a reasonable way. And so I ended up leaving just because I think they probably did a pretty good job of destroying my reputation. I didn't get fired from Penn State, so kudos to them for not, firing me or anything like that. And then I just started talking about this stuff full time and giving talks and writing about it on my website, Reality's Last Stand. And I work for the Manhattan Institute now, where we're involved in, I basically do the biology side of things. I do a lot of expert testimony for court cases around the US and internationally. For, when a state or a country tries to implement a law that sex is real, I both help write these laws about the reality of sex and what it means to be male or female. And then I often come and defend them in court and get cross-examined by ACLU lawyers who have no idea what they're talking about. It's really quite fun. So that's what I'm doing nowadays.
Well, first, I mean, take your case, which it just because of my personality, it infuriates me. That's why I am in the public eye, because I can't shy away from fighting for these things. It pisses me off that your destiny, if I can put it in fatalistic terms, was determined by all of these parasitic ideas, right? I mean, academia is supposed to nurture, intellectual pursuits, truth seeking. Here's a guy who comes along who, you're hardly someone who's very bombastic and who tries to be, of the little that I've seen of your work, and I'm going to follow it more closely now. You certainly strike me as someone who's very calm in your demeanor. You're not trying to hurt anybody. And yet, the very real consequence was that you said, I've got two choices. I could try to continue in academia, or congratulations, you won, I'm out. Well, that decision that you made, because I've been a professor now for 30 plus years and have been, I guess, the guy who's most fighting against this stuff, I get your story 1,000 times a year from people who say, look,
Yeah.
I'm just finishing my PhD in clinical psychology. I'm out. I'm finishing my PhD in biological anthropology. I'm out. So imagine the amount of brain power that you
Oh
are.
yeah.
So it's not just these esoteric, philosophical conversations. There are real consequences. And of course, there are many real consequences, one of which you're losing people that we spent many years training who say, this is not for me. I'd rather go do something else. And maybe now you don't regret your decision. Maybe you're very fulfilled, but it should be you who makes that decision rather than the chilling effect of people saying, you better stop doing this or else you'll
Yeah.
never get a
Yeah.
job. It's horrible.
Well, I often say that they really shouldn't have done what they did, not just because, principles and things like that, but it would have been in their best interest to just let me poke my spiders and wasps in my laboratory tubes rather than me just dedicating like almost every waking hour to writing expert testimony in court cases and
Right.
writing explainers and doing videos on this. So like they've kind of created a monster in that sense. So um I'm very happy doing what I'm doing now because I think it's very important to get these ideas out there, and I get to, I miss having students, that type of thing, and being able to interact with them and teach courses. Um, but I do have a much bigger audience for my writing and the things I talk about
So if
in science more
today,
generally.
let's suppose some university, Smith College, calls up, hey, Dr. Wright, we've got the ecosystem for you. I'm a big fan of your spider and other insect research. Please come set up a lab, assistant professorship. Would this be something that stops you in your track for a minute and you're thinking about whether you want to go back to, or have you put academia in the rearview mirror, never to return to it?
Um, I don't think I'll return to being sort of having my own lab type of thing, but I am still writing articles. So I published a peer-reviewed book chapter with Dr. Emma Hilton, who also talks about this, called The Two Sexes, just because there wasn't any peer-reviewed articles that make the banal statement that there's only two sexes and here's why. It was just sort of this, everyone knew that that's the way it was. And, you don't have papers you can cite in physics that say like objects fall down, like this is, or gravity is real. It's just, here's the equations, it's been mapped out. We've measured these things. And so I'm kind of in a good spot where I can write articles for scientific journals without having to be directly in academia and have to apply for grants and all the bad stuff and the stuff I didn't like about academia. So I get to sort of launch my my rockets over there and do sort of my academic thing while at the same time not being just completely immersed in it. Now, if they were to have, since I just moved to Nashville recently and bought a house here, so I don't plan to move anywhere for a long time, maybe forever. So if maybe Vanderbilt were to want me to start a lab of some sort dealing with this topic of sex differences and pushing back against the literature that's out there that's spreading rapidly, that's something we can talk about too, is all the papers that are coming out in big journals that are just crap in the bed about what it means to be male or female. Because we need an army of people that are responding, doing letters to the editors, writing rebuttals to these things, and publishing our own articles, saying basically that sex is real and no, this because there's intersex conditions doesn't mean sex is a spectrum. And the only reason that we know clownfish change sex is because their gametes change from being, from producing one type of gamete to another. And this is strangely and bizarrely the type of thing that we need to be publishing in scientific journals that I would love to be contributing to.
What do you, I mean, I'm going to ask this with some incredulity, despite the fact that I'm the author of The Parasitic Mind. So nothing should surprise me about
Yeah.
these parasitized minds. But then I see, here comes Sean Carroll, Mr. Physics. I'm very smart, who then explains to the rest of us simpletons that no, sex is not binary. Here comes scientist Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's never
Oh
published a
my God.
scientific paper, who explains to us, I don't know if you saw it, I did a satirical
No, I
take
did.
on it, depending on how much makeup you wear or whether, and I actually did a clip where I started putting on a wig, I started putting on half of lipstick, and depending on how much female accoutrement I put on, it changed how female I became,
Yeah.
because that's what Neil deGrasse Tyson had explained on a show with this incredible intellectual pomposity, right? I'm a physicist and I'm explaining to you that it is absolutely not true that there is male and female. So do you think, I'm asking you here to speculate, so I know you don't know what's inside their hearts or in the deep recesses of their mind. Do you think that Sean Carroll, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and other parasitized, lobotomized guys, do they in the deep recesses of their minds know that they are lying, but that it is pragmatic to posture in this way? Or have they found a way to actually believe in the lie?
I think it's a weird combination of ignorance and this desire to cling on to what were our previous, what I would call liberal in the classic sense, values, and the direction that we used to be going as a society, where it was, we have males and females. Some males are feminine and like to wear makeup, and some females are more masculine and have a more butch presentation, don't like to wear dresses, and just to be comfortable with sex nonconformity and let that be the norm, and don't bully people for their personality preferences and behaviors that they like to express, like, so insofar it's not criminal. That's where we were going. And I think people like Sean Carroll and Neil deGrasse Tyson, they they think that this new ideology is just this is that. They think that's what it is. And then this is coupled with an ignorance about what sex is fundamentally, rooted in gametes. And so you
How
get
could
them
you be,
saying,
forgive me for interrupting you. Sorry to interrupt you.
yeah,
How could you have existed in the world for 50, 60 years? I don't know how old they are. Presumably they've had children. Presumably, so you don't like, you're a Darwinian being. Like, you don't have to be an evolutionary psychologist or an evolutionary biologist studying sex differences in spiders to be able to put your imprimatur on what gametes do and so on. So I can't believe that they
yeah.
just don't know any better.
Yeah, it's true. I've been shocked at how seemingly difficult the gametic foundation of sex is hard to instill in people's minds, and I think a lot of it is because you don't see people's gametes during the day. When you meet people in public, we're seeing secondary sex characteristics under clothing. We're seeing where we can make a pretty convincing, educated guess, and you'd be accurate almost every single time of what sex somebody is. But when we're the signals that we're using, the cues we're picking up when we're putting male and female boxes on people in our minds, isn't gametes, and so people get this impression that, oh, I guess sex is kind of this bimodal thing that's related to secondary sex characteristics, and oh, gametes are a component of sex, but they view sex as really just like all these different traits. They don't distinguish between sort of the upstream causes of sex, like chromosomes for humans and mammals, and the downstream consequences of sex, like differences in morphology and facial shape and body size and strength and that stuff. They just sort of put it all in one big blender, and they think that's what sex is. I cannot really forgive people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Sean Carroll, because they're supposed to be science educators. They should know better. It's unclear if they do know better or if they're just trying to maintain that liberal, the left side of the
Yeah.
audience by pretending to kind of do this liberal, like accept everyone, without sort of understanding how actually against all of these values the gender ideology is. Because what gender ideology says is, well, no, if you are a little boy who is behaving more typical of a girl, then you actually have a gender incongruence. You have you were born in the wrong body. You have a female brain and a boy's body. And that can be fixed by changing your body to match your brain. Because if we do the opposite, if we try to, convince you to change your behavior to match your body, that's conversion therapy. But, injecting drugs and doing surgeries somehow isn't conversion therapy for these
That's
kids.
gender
So
affirming care.
it's gender affirming. Yeah, of course. So
Okay, go.
there's a lot of social reasons that they're doing this. I can't even like look Neil deGrasse Tyson in the eye after he had that those videos, because he's so influential, and I just knew that like he's just creating so much more work for me,
Maybe
and
that's a good thing.
could be, yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess I'll be in business for a while, I suppose.
So let's suppose, so on that point, suppose that your services are no longer required, Dr. Wright. Is there a next idea pathogen that you might turn your cognitive acuity toward? Or, I mean, or are you, I'm the evolutionary biology guy who can really weigh in on sex differences, and I'm riding that train into the sunset? Or, so for example, before you answer my question, let me tell you, for me, right? I call myself, I'm a parasitologist of the human mind, right? So any bullshit that is spewed by a human mind is fair game to me, right? So I go after, so yes, of course, the biophobia and the rejection of biology in studying human affairs is one idea pathogen, as is social constructivism, as is cultural relativism. So in other words, I target my I point my weaponry to any purveyor of bullshit.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
view yourself ultimately as that, or are you very much, you're focused on that specific issue?
So I'm focused on this at the moment because I think it's the most critical. There are other aspects I can see it jumping to. So we had a big review out of the UK. It's called the CAS review. I don't know if you've heard about that, but it's based on 7 systematic reviews of the evidence to show there wasn't good evidence for any of these procedures in minors and young people who have issues with their so-called gender identity. So that's what I'm mainly focused on, and trying to get people to understand that a lot of these policies are rooted in this idea that sex is this multi-level spectrum that can all be changed just by, adding hormones and surgeries. You can change the secondary sex characteristics, and therefore that changes your sex. But then there's another more fundamental aspect too. This whole literature about brain sex and about how your brain can have a different sex than your body. There's this whole pseudoscientific literature out there about this, and this is also being used as a justification for these surgeries because if you have a brain sex and you have a body sex and those can be different, then that's the sort of justification for modifying kids' bodies to match their brain sex. Um, but then there's there's those things. But then just recently on Twitter or X, you're probably aware when Tucker Carlson was recently on Joe Rogan and he made these claims about, no one believes in Darwinian evolution
Of
anymore.
course, yes,
And
yes.
so I was just shocked because I looked around and there was just no one actually taking up the mantle and being like, this is complete BS. Like, what are we talking about? So I was just going hard online about this and seeing these same arguments that it was almost nostalgic because I was like, oh my God, I got my start talking about creationism, intelligent design. And like all of the same arguments are there. They're slightly modified. I guess they've evolved slightly over time and mutated. And I can just see that as the right sort of gains more social cachet, more power in the institutions, it's just going to be emboldening these people that I guess have been there for a long time. They're going to crawl out from underneath the floorboards and start trying to, get evolution out of schools again or something. So I can imagine that I'll be useful there in the future. And when we go back to, moving forward and going back in time to the 2010s when this was a big issue. Yeah, I mean, I'll just keep commenting on whatever I think is the most insane mania at the time. Hopefully, I can lend my expertise to it. Fortunately, with the whole biology of sex thing, I can. With evolution denialism, I can do that as well.
Sure.
And I'm sure I'll be able to modify to something else. And I have a Substack. I can write about whatever I want on there. And maybe I'll have to get some other. Maybe I'll get a real job. But I would actually be totally fine having this issue, winning this issue, and just I'll always have a social media account, so they'll always be there to some degree in the public eye. But I can see myself ratcheting things down. I didn't get into this to be a celebrity biologist or anything like that. I really got into this because I think that this issue not only was just completely insane, but amazingly extremely harmful. And so if I could just if I was satisfied that that was taken care of and that that's on the downs and going away, yeah, I would be actually very comfortable no longer being quite as much of a public figure as I am now. So
Got
yeah,
you.
we'll see.
Just speaking about evolution denialism, I've made the point, I think I made it most famously on an appearance on Joe Rogan, where I explained that, uh, you know, uh, parasitic thinking and imbecilic thinking is what, while I focus a lot more on the left, only because the idea pathogens that I discuss all emanate from the university ecosystem, and most professors are leftists. I specifically make the point in very early in the parasitic mind that it's not as though it is only people on the left that have the capacity to be parasitized. And as specifically relating to evolution, when it comes to the denial of evolution, it's much more likely to be right-leaning folks. When it comes to the denial of evolutionary psychology, it's much more likely to be left-leaning folks. So
Yeah.
that actually is a beautiful way to demonstrate that even within the same sphere of a discipline, evolution in general versus evolutionary psychology in particular, you could have one side of the political eye or the other one acting like complete imbecilic buffoons.
Yeah.
But that leads me to the next point, to your point about, being able to be someone who's useful in this area for many years to come. I actually think that the human mind is built, regrettably, to not accept evolution and evolutionary psychology. In other words, there are elements of the architecture of the human mind that makes it a default value for most
Yeah.
people to say, la, 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 I don't want to hear it. So it's not as though here comes God Saad with his, persuasive techniques and charm, and he is once and for all going to slay that dragon, and we're done. We're not having that conversation, because I've seen it in my now 30 plus year career. Just a new generation of imbeciles comes along that
Hmm.
raises the exact same points, and you have to slay the exact same dragons. The phoenix keeps rising from the
Yeah.
ashes.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Now, something I'm, learning as I am going through at least one more iteration of this, when I've seen this shift sort of go from, Richard Dawkins owns creationist person videos to Ben Shapiro owns woke activist on campus. And I see a lot of the same arguments too about the people who are denying the reality of sex as I saw when I was sort of battling the creationists and ID people. Um, One of these examples is sort of this argument from complexity, this sort of irreducible
Yes.
complexity argument, where you talk about, though this thing couldn't have possibly evolved because it couldn't have gone through these series of intermediate forms. It's irreducibly complex. And then it's slightly different, but it's still an argument from complexity, but on the sex denialism side, where they try to just make these graphs and be like, sex is so complex. It's, your hormones, if you're an alligator, temperatures, it's your hormonal milieu, it's your secondary sex characteristics, it's your body hair, it's your voice pitch, it's all these different levels. It's so complex that we can't even like begin to say what the sex of an individual is, because who are we to tell them they're not a male or a female? Because no body is the same. It's all just so complex. We just need to throw our hands up and let them tell us, what they identify as. It's a very similar ways of thinking. And every once in a while, a new one will come up where I'll just be like, that fits the exact,
Yeah.
just snaps into the same mode of thinking. And you can sort of see, I guess there's maybe these like fallacious archetypal ways of thinking, I
Yeah.
guess, that people fall into, that are just, it's just it's sort of like a Mad Lib. You just plug in your your system, and
Exactly.
but it's the same structure of terrible argument. And so I think a lot of the ways that me battling creationists and ID people, that was like the first battle
Yeah.
that prepared me for what I'm doing now, because I can just identify all the same fallacies, everything. It's just like I've been here before. It's fascinating.
Right. All right. Are there any projects, last question, that you're currently working on that you'd like to use this opportunity to discuss or promote? Take it away.
Well, nothing that you can purchase immediately, but I am working on a book. It's right now tentatively called Reality's Last Stand: The Modern Denial of Biological Sex. So there's been a lot of books that have sort of touched on sort of sex pseudoscience, very passingly. So what I'm going to be doing, because we didn't get a chance to go into the many different, there's just so many different arguments that they have for denying the sex binary. There's probably 20 that we could go into that are all being used by the same people, even though many of these arguments are mutually exclusive and they shouldn't be able to exist in the same mind. And so the book I'm working on is basically just a one-stop shop to understand what sex is, wide evolved, debunking every single activist argument for sex not being a binary, and giving people the sort of the tools, the mental toolkit they have to combat it, and basically why this is coming about, and the harms that it produces in society and how to push back. So I'm hoping that's going to come out probably early next year. That's my goal. But yeah, that's something to look forward to. And then my Substack is called Reality's Last Stand. I publish a lot of stuff on sex and gender affirming care over there, and any other topic. I'm trying to expand it to other topics of sort of just pseudoscience in general, any area where people are denying basic facts about the world around us.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Colin. It was a pleasure to finally meet you. Look forward to your book coming out, at which point I'd love to have you back to discuss it. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks, Gad. Appreciate it.
Cheers. Take care.